Hello, and welcome back to yet another video. This one, as you can see from the title, is going to be wrapping up the Mark Twain segment that I've been doing on this channel. So if you haven't seen part one, probably want to check that one out because it talks about his early life. But this is definitely going to be the longer part of the two parts. And we'll get into a little bit more of his adult life and what happens to him once he finds success through his very famous books. Back then, and even today, very famous. I'm sure if you've seen part one, Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, that's the guy who created those characters. So you can imagine he gets his big break in the 1860s, 1870s. At that time, in the United States, or anywhere, there are no movie stars, there are no TV stars, there are no professional athletes. So this guy is going to be a major celebrity wherever he goes. The name Mark Twain is going to cause quite a stir if he shows up in a town. But before we get into reading the article, let's talk about a few words that we will find that might give us trouble. And the first one is fictional. First one we come to will be fictional. The way I remember fictional is fake. Fiction, fake. Nonfiction is real. So the vast majority of Mark Twain's work is going to be fictional. It's going to be about characters that he has made up. A lot of times we'll see based on people he knows or maybe the places where he has lived, but definitely fictional. There is no Tom Sawyer, and there is no Huck Finn. He created them. The next word is apprentice. Apprentice. And we don't see a whole lot of this in the United States anymore. People will mostly go to college or trade school for this. But during Twain's time, which is a little hard to say, during Twain's time, having an apprenticeship was a lot more common. And that is where you work for a person who is an expert in the field for a period of time. And that might vary. But if you wanted to become a blacksmith, maybe back then, working with metal of some sort, you might become an apprentice for a year or two, or maybe longer. You might get paid, you might not get paid, but you would learn that trade that you were being an apprentice under, like a master, they might call it. So an apprentice is the person who is learning, and the apprenticeship is what they are doing. So a sentence you could use with those two words would be, the apprentice has had an apprenticeship with the plumber for 2 years. Something like that. The next one is steamboat. And the easiest way to explain that is to show a picture. But it's just a very large boat that runs on steam. We don't see many of these anymore. They might be around for nostalgia's sake, for old time's sake, just to show what it once looked like. But nowadays we have way more efficient ways of traveling. Back then, 1860s, you don't have airplanes. Trains are rare. So steamboats were a really effective way of moving cargo or moving people from one place to the other, as long as there was a river. But steamboats would be able to go against the current. They would be able to go upstream instead of always just flowing goods downstream. So it was a big invention at the time. Nowadays, not so much, not that effective. But in the article, it will actually say, back then, it was almost like being an airline pilot, like a really coveted job. People really looked up to steamboat captains. And the next two words go together. It's Union and Confederacy. And if you know anything about the Civil War, basically it is when the northern part of the United States fought a war against the southern part of the United States. The South was called the Confederacy, and the North was called the Union. And of course, Mark Twain is going to live through the Civil War, which lasts from about 1861 to 1865. And it is after the Civil War that Mark Twain will get his first big break. You will also hear the term Great American West. And that's when Mark Twain connects back to Sacagawea. Now remember, Sacagawea lived about 50 years before Mark Twain is going to make his journey to the West. But it was because of her and Lewis and Clark that really opened the West up to settlers, to white settlers. Of course, there were other people, Native Americans, living there before, but it was really important to the government for people to go out west and settle. And Mark Twain would be not the first wave, but maybe the second or third. Once other settlers were out there, Mark Twain makes his way from Missouri to places like California and Nevada. The next word can be pretty tricky. It's satirical. Satirical. It's an adjective that describes a noun. But let's talk about the way the noun sounds first, and that is satire. Satire. If you've ever watched any late night talk shows like Stephen Colbert, if you've ever seen that, he does a lot of satire. So when we talk about satire, you're going to be talking about something that's funny, most likely, going to have a lot of humor, but it's also going to talk about maybe a political situation, something that's a little bit more serious, but it is covered up in humor. If you've ever seen Saturday Night Live, when they talk about politics, it's almost always satirical. So they might be making fun of the president or somebody who holds a high office, but at the same time, they will do a rather serious comment on how they might disagree with it. And some of Mark Twain's nonfiction writing and fictional writing will be classified as satirical. So definitely funny, definitely witty, if you remember that word from the first part, definitely witty, but also having like a little poke at the government. The next word I'd like to talk about is gilded. It's a good word to know, gilded, and it literally means covered in gold. Usually it's a thin layer of gold. This country actually had something called the Gilded Age, and that was a time when business was booming and there was a lot of money to go around in the United States. And that was a few years after the Civil War, like 1880s, 1890s, the Gilded Age. It was a good time to be in business because so many people were getting rich at the time. And government was kind of backing off and letting people become rich, have monopolies. So a few people were getting very, very rich. And the last word is prospected. Prospected. And it does have that root word spect in there. And anytime you see that in English, be thinking about something looking, spect. If you put on your spectacles, they help you see. If you're watching a football game, you are a spectator. So a prospector, and it's usually only used for like mining for gold. You might call this person a prospector. They are looking for gold, looking for silver, looking for some sort of precious metal, a natural resource. Prospector. If anybody has seen Toy Story 2, one of my favorite movies, they have that prospector toy. He looks like he's gonna go in some kind of tunnel and mine for gold. Prospector. That's where that comes from. So now that you are an expert in all of the difficult vocabulary that we might encounter, let's finish reading the article. And of course, we should always read the subheading there. And I'm going to start off with Life in Hannibal. And remember, that's in Missouri. Hannibal, that's where he's from. That's where he grew up. Hannibal inspired several of Twain's fictional places, including St. Petersburg and Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Clemens left school at 12 years old when he found employment as an apprentice printer at the Hannibal Courier newspaper to make money for his family. In 1851, at 15, he got a job as a printer, writer, and editor at the Hannibal Western Union, a newspaper owned by his brother, Orion. So notice the context clues that were in that last sentence, Hannibal Western Union. I had never heard of it, but luckily the author let us know what it was. It was a newspaper. So sometimes when you come to these new words or new terms, oftentimes the author will leave a little piece in there to give you a hint, which they did right there. Then, in 1857, 21-year-old Clemens began learning the art of steering a steamboat on the Mississippi River. He had his license by 1859 and loved this career. It was an exciting, well-paying, and high-status job, like flying airplanes today, but it was cut short in 1861 by the start of the Civil War. As the war began, the people of Missouri split between support for the Union and the Confederacy. Clemens joined the Confederate Army in June 1861, but served for only a couple of weeks because his unit broke up. Where, he wondered then, would he find his future? What venue would bring him both excitement and wealth? His answer was the Great American West. And maybe we should talk just a little bit about how Missouri became a state. 200 years ago, in 1820, Missouri came in as a slave state. But to keep the balance in government between slave states and free states, they also allowed another state to enter the Union. And that state was the state of Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts since the original 13 colonies. But to be honest, Missouri wasn't a true slave state. They came in to keep the balance. And yes, people did own slaves in Missouri, but it wasn't a state that could actually support slavery. They didn't have the industries like cotton or tobacco or rice that really would be necessary to have slaves. So it was really split. And when Missouri decided to leave the Union and join the Confederacy, there were a lot of people who disagreed with that. The next section here, heading out west. In July 1861, Clemens climbed on board a stagecoach and headed for Nevada and California, where he would live for the next 5 years. At first, he prospected for gold and silver, but by the middle of 1862, he was broke and needed a different job. That September, he went to work as a reporter for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise and adopted the pen name Mark Twain, which was steamboat slang for 12 feet of water. And if you check the description box, I put a link to a video about 2 minutes long that talks more about how Mark Twain got his pen name. And a pen name is what somebody writes under, like a fictional name, a fake name. So his name was Samuel Clemens, but when he would write his books, he would produce them under the name Mark Twain. Twain became one of the best-known storytellers in the West. He had a distinctive style, friendly, funny, often satirical, and always eager to take pokes at people who thought they were more important than they were. He got a big break in 1865 when one of his tales about life in a mining camp called Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog was printed in newspapers and magazines around the country. At 34, this handsome, red-haired, friendly, and ambitious journalist had become one of the most popular and famous writers in America. A family and famous books. Twain's dearest wish was to be rich, and in February 1870, he married Olivia Langdon, the daughter of a wealthy New York coal merchant. The couple settled in Buffalo, New York, and later had 4 children. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was published in 1876, and soon after he began writing a sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Both books are still considered today to be great American classics. For perhaps the first time in America, The vivid, sometimes crude voice of regular people was used to create great literature. Huck Finn was finally finished in 1884. Twain's other books included The Prince and the Pauper, Life on the Mississippi, and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Twain invested in different businesses in hopes of making a lot of money, but he never achieved the wealth he expected. Later work. Twain's last 15 years were filled with public honors. Probably the most famous American of the late 1800s, he was photographed and applauded wherever he went. He'd become one of the most prominent celebrities in the world and traveled widely overseas. Personal struggles. But while those years were gilded with awards, they also brought him much anguish. Early in their marriage, he and his wife Livy had lost their toddler son, Langdon, to a childhood disease. Later, 2 of his daughters died as young adults, and the loss broke his heart. For many years, Twain's relationship with his middle daughter, Clara, was distant, full of fights. Then, in June 1904, Livy died after a long illness. So we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. People were still dying of very common infections, high fevers. Modern medicine hadn't quite figured out how to get rid of some of these very common ailments we have today, but they are easily fixed. So it wasn't uncommon for parents to lose children back then, or for children to lose parents at a rather young age. But for Twain to lose all 4 of his children, that was probably not the norm. Didn't always happen. That was an extreme case. Last 2 paragraphs. Twain became bitter in his later years, showing insensitivity to friends and loved ones. He wrote a fair amount, but was unable to finish most of his projects. His memory failed, and he had bouts of rage and experienced periods of depression. He tried to relieve them by smoking cigars, reading in bed, and playing endless hours of billiards and cards. Twain died on April 21st, 1910, at the age of 74, at his home in Redding, Connecticut. So just for the record, smoking cigars is bad. Don't be like Mark Twain and smoke cigars. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a little bit about Mark Twain, and I will see you next time.